Hi everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcabbage. I'm back for our second edition of Thyroid Thursdays. Last week we talked about basic thyroid physiology. Today we're going to talk about a thyroid panel, what should be in a thyroid panel. We'll do a quick review of last Thursday's presentation. We talked about basic thyroid physiology. Every cell in the body's got a thyroid receptor, and when the cells need more thyroid hormone, because the thyroid hormone sets our metabolism, it sends signals to the hypothalamus and to the pituitary gland and says, hey, I need more thyroid hormone. Hypothalamus releases something called thyroid releasing hormone that signals the pituitary gland to start making something called thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid gland, starts kicking in thyroid hormone production in the cells of the thyroid gland, and we produce two types of thyroid hormone, T3, T4, primarily the forms that are produced. T4 is the active form, T4 is the inactive form, T3 is the active form. Once we have the T3 that's produced is only about 7% directly from the thyroid gland. Once it's produced, it's ready to go. It gets onto a thyroid binding globulin, which is the carrier molecule that carries the thyroid hormone around the cells, or around the body to the cells. Once it finds a cell that needs thyroid hormone, the thyroid, or the T3 gets out of the thyroid binding globulin, or comes off the thyroid binding globulin. It now becomes free T3 that can diffuse into the nucleus of the cells. The thyroid hormone then binds to receptor sites at the nucleus, and that kicks the metabolism into gear. The T4, that has to go get converted into T3, and that happens in a few tissues. 60% of the thyroid hormone that's made at the thyroid gland goes off to the liver to be converted from T4 to T3. 20% goes to the gut to be converted from T4 to T3. And another 20% goes off to the peripheral tissues to be converted from T4 to T3. The T4 also binds to a thyroid binding globulin, and once it carries it to these areas, the conversion occurs. T3 is ready to get back into the thyroid binding globulin, taxied around the body, find the cells that need the hormone support and provide that support. That's how the mechanism works. So when we need more thyroid hormone, we get more signals to the hypothalamus, we should see increase in thyroid releasing hormone, we should see an increase in TSH, and that should create an increase in our hormones. When we have plenty of thyroid hormone, we have we get a shutdown of this process. We have plenty of the hormone being produced. We tell the thyroid gland to stop making it, we tell the pituitary gland to stop making it, we essentially get inhibition of those areas. And so production decreases. So when somebody thinks they have thyroid problems, they want to get a thyroid panel done. And there's quite a few tests that can be done to run a complete thyroid panel. Unfortunately, it's traditionally not done. The first test that's typically always done is what's called a TSH, and that's thyroid stimulating hormone. And so just as I said, when the cells need more thyroid hormone, hypothalamus kicks in TRH. TRH stimulates the pituitary gland to make more TSH. So when we see an elevated TSH in a lab, we're typically thinking the person needs more thyroid hormone. We call that more of a hypothyroid state. And when we see TSH is decreased, we would call that more of a hyperthyroid state. The cells or the thyroid gland is producing plenty of T4, T3, and that's sending signals up to the hypothalamus and the pituitary to say, hey, stop. It's decreasing that TSH production because we have too much hormone as it is. Okay? So that's typically run, and sometimes that's the only test that's ever run. The problem is that the range is pretty broad, 0.45 to 4.5 depending on the lab that you go to. And so if that range is pretty broad, you could be symptomatic and still be within that range. In a functional medicine model, we like to take a look at a range between 8.0 to 3.0, and some say that maybe even lower, skewed a little bit lower, is maybe better. But step one, got to run a TSH as part of almost every panel, and we want to see if TSH is up, we typically are thinking a hypothyroid state, and if TSH is low, most doctors are thinking more of a hyperthyroid state. And you could have hypothyroidism even though your TSH is actually low, but that's for another day. Other tests that are typically run in a standard panel is T4, which is how much thyroid hormone is the thyroid gland producing. So they may look at this marker right here. And the assumption is that as long as I have enough T4, then the rest of this process, the conversion of T4 to T3, and the carrying of the T3 to the cells and the ability to get into the cell and work, you're assuming that if the T4 is good, the rest of that process works. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But these are usually the two markers that are run on a standard panel. There are a whole bunch more, however, that should be run so we can take a look at the rest of the thyroid physiology. Because if we just do those two markers, the only thing we know is this. And there's a whole bunch of systems down here, or pieces to this thyroid physiology, that we don't have a clue as to whether they're working or not. So the other test that would be really important is T3. So how much T3 is being made? How much T3 is actually being converted? So how much of that actual T4 is actually being converted into T3? And the reason that's so important is that T4 isn't what actually gets into the cells of the body. It's not T4 that gets in here, it's actually T3. So it's important to know what that conversion from T4 to T3 is. Now, if T3 is low, then we know we've got some problems here, here, and here. Right? Because the bulk of the conversion of T4 to T3 occurs in the liver, gut, and peripheral tissues. So we know we've got a problem there. But if you don't run it, you don't know that it's good. You're just assuming if I've got T4 that I'm getting conversion to all these tissues. But what if you have a liver problem? What if you're insulin resistant? What if you have a gut problem? You have dysbiosis, yeast, or bacterial overgrowth. You may not get the conversion. And what if the conversion is not occurring in your peripheral tissues? There's enzymes that are responsible for that conversion process, and if they're not working appropriately, this stuff doesn't occur. Okay? Next test that should be on a thyroid panel is called free T4. And free T4 is the T4 that is not bound to that carrier molecule. So this is free-floating thyroid hormone. And it's important. Free T4 is really important. And one of the reasons it's really important is there is something called vitamin B2. It's called riboflavin. And riboflavin is the form that most people know it as, but we need to convert riboflavin into its activated vitamin form, which is called FAD. And FAD, the conversion of riboflavin to FAD, actually requires free T4. And if we have inadequate amounts of free T4, we can't convert our riboflavin into an activated form. And that affects lots of cellular systems. It affects lots of chemical and hormone reactions. There are a ton of enzymatic reactions that require FAD. And so if we don't have adequate levels of free T4, we can affect all of our systems in our physiology because we can't get that activated form. So it's important to test free T4. What's next? Well, it'd probably be good to take a look at something called free T3. Now, why would free T3 be important? T4 and T3 are what's in this, bound to this thyroid binding globulin, the carrier molecule. When it's bound to the thyroid binding globulin molecule, it's inactive, it's not usable. It needs to get off the thyroid binding globulin and become a free hormone to actually get into the cells. So if we have normal T3, but we have inadequate levels of free T3, that's what actually gets into the cellular system. So we need to know what the free T3 status is so that we know if we've got enough free thyroid hormone getting into our cells. The next marker we may want to take a look at is reverse T3. So what is reverse T3? Reverse T3 is T3 in a non-usable form. So if I have nutrient deficiencies, if I have stress response, I may not be able to convert the T4 into the T3. And if I can't convert T4 into T3, I can get an overproduction of what's called reverse T3. This is a non-usable form of T3. It should be part of every panel because if my reverse T3 levels are out of proportion to my free T3 or my T3 levels, that means I'm converting too much of my T3 or free T3 into reverse T3, which is non-usable. In that situation, I could have optimal levels of T4, but if my conversion is primarily to reverse T3 and not to T3 or free T3, I can have hypothyroid symptoms even though TSH and T4 are normal. So reverse T3 is really important. And it's really important for some people to understand that it's not so much what the number is, but it's important to me as the physician, what's the ratio? there should be a ratio between reverse T3 and T3. T3 to reverse T3 ratio should be greater than 10, and the free T3 to reverse T3 ratio should be somewhere greater than 20. If those ratios are less than that, I'm getting more conversion of my thyroid hormone to reverse T3 or useless T3, and that can cause me to be hypothyroid even though TSH and T4 are normal. So let's talk about something called T3 uptake. So T3 uptake is essentially a marker that tells me how much hormone is bound to the thyroid binding globulin. So if I have high T3 uptake, that means I don't have much thyroid hormone bound to the thyroid binding globulin. If I have low T3 uptake, that means I've got a lot of hormone bound to this thyroid binding globulin. And the reason that's important is if my thyroid T3 uptake levels are too low, below range, that means most of my thyroid hormone is stuck in the thyroid binding globulin. It's not usable in that form. I need it to be in the free form. If my T3 uptake level is too high, that means I don't have enough thyroid binding hormone bound to those thyroid binding globulins, and I may have too much free hormone floating around in comparison. So that's another marker. Another marker I like to take a look at is what's called TPO antibodies. And TPO antibodies are thyroid peroxidase antibodies. So there's an enzyme that's stimulated by TSH production that's called TPO, thyroid peroxidase. And that helps in the process of converting using the iodine to help make the thyroid hormone. Sometimes the body actually produces antibodies. So our immune system decides that the thyroid peroxidase is a problem and needs to be destroyed. This is associated with an autoimmune disorder called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It is the #1 cause of hypothyroidism in the United States. And if we have antibodies to TPO, that means every time the thyroid's trying to make thyroid hormone, it's increasing TPO activity. As it increases TPO activity, the immune system produces more antibodies, which can lead to more destruction of the thyroid gland. So we want to see what TPO antibodies are. We also want to take a look at another marker called thyroglobulin antibodies. And thyroglobulin is a substance that's inside the thyroid gland, and it is essentially a carbon backbone with a whole bunch of tyrosine molecules bound to it. And so it's the thyroglobulin that is really the precursor to T3 and T4. If the body's producing antibodies against thyroglobulin, this is another marker of Hashimoto's autoimmune thyroiditis, and that means the immune system is starting to attack this thyroglobulin molecule. That's not good, because when it attacks this thyroglobulin molecule, it creates damage in the thyroid, swelling, inflammation, and it reduces the amount of thyroid hormone I can produce, essentially producing hypothyroidism. So this is a more complete thyroid panel, and something we would want to see somebody have run if we're going to evaluate their thyroid physiology. In a traditional model, this is maybe max what is run, just the TSH and just the T4. And that's only giving us information here and here. It doesn't tell us what's happening here. It doesn't tell us how this conversion is occurring. And it doesn't tell us what's getting into the cell. And it doesn't tell us what may be being wasted and going into the trash can, okay? Which would be our reverse T3. So it tells us what's going on here, here, and here. And so TSH, T4, very simply, that's old science of being able just to determine what's happening with the thyroid gland based on a TSH and T4. This is really more up to date. Look at the full panel so that you can fully understand what's going on. I'd urge one more thing. When you're going to your doctor to ask for a thyroid panel, make sure they're running a more complete thyroid panel. But I would also ask for a comprehensive metabolic panel that takes a look at other markers like iron and your iron storage markers. It looks at cholesterol. It looks at your inflammatory markers. It's going to look at your insulin resistance and how you're regulating blood sugar. It's going to look at your vitamin D status, because as we're going to talk about on other Thyroid Thursdays, how other parts of your chemistry affect your thyroid physiology, especially things like vitamin D. It's critical to have optimal levels of vitamin D for the thyroid hormone to bind to the receptor and actually be used. Without adequate levels of vitamin D, that doesn't happen. So it doesn't matter if all of this stuff is good, if your vitamin D level is low, even if the thyroid hormone gets to the nucleus of the cell, binds to the receptor, you're going to have poor function. Okay? So that's today's Thyroid Thursday. Hope you got some information out of that. If you have any questions, you can put them right below the video and I'll get back to you. Other than that, I look forward to talking to you or giving you some more information on our next Thyroid Thursday. Take care.